Today's lesson is the pentose phosphate pathway. This can be found in section 4 of chapter 13 of Essential Biochemistry. You might recall that in this chapter we've already discussed several pathways involved in carbohydrate metabolism. We've talked about glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, the degradation and synthesis of glycogen metabolism, and today we want to talk about the pentose phosphate pathway. Here is an outline of the anabolic pathways. And today's pathway, the pentose phosphate pathway, is outlined in this box right here. Here we see that glucose can be transformed into ribose, and that can be converted to deoxyribose, and then these are important metabolites needed to make DNA and RNA. What's not being shown here is that the pentose phosphate pathway also produces NADPH as a product. So you might remember from our previous study that glucose-6-phosphate is a key branch point of many pathways in the liver. So what you should do now is to pause this video and make a list for yourself, or maybe draw a diagram of all of the pathways that involve glucose-6-phosphate. Hopefully you've ended up with something that looks like this. I can link to this animated figure here that shows glucose-6-phosphate is a product of glycogen breakdown. It is a reactant for glycogen synthesis. That glucose is phosphorylated to yield glucose-6-phosphate. Glucose-6-phosphate is a product in gluconeogenesis, and it is a reactant in the pentose phosphate pathway, which is the subject of our lesson today. Glucose-6-phosphate can be transformed to pyruvate using the glycolipid pathway. And in some tissues, such as the liver, glucose-6-phosphate can be broken down to glucose using the enzyme glucose-6-phosphatase. Pyruvate will eventually enter the citric acid cycle, which is the subject of chapter 14. And we will also see that pyruvate has many links to amino acids, and that pyruvate can also be transformed into lactate. So in our study of glycolysis, we learned that glycolysis yielded ATP, this cellular energy currency. We can also refer to NADPH as cellular energy currency in the term of reducing power. NADPH possesses electrons and protons, another form of cellular energy currency, which is needed by anabolic reactions that require those electrons and protons. So because glucose can produce both ATP and NADPH, the cell needs to regulate the balance between these two pathways. Here is an outline of the pentose phosphate pathway. Again, the major products are ribose for DNA, RNA, and coenzyme production such as NAD and FADH2. And it also produces NADPH for fatty acid and cholesterol biosynthesis. NADPH also reduces glutathione and reactive oxygen species, so NADPH is an important metabolite in some cells. Now this diagram right now at the beginning of our lecture might not make very much sense, but I promise that I will break it down for you. Here's a list of pathways requiring NADPH, so you can see that the pentose phosphate pathway will be fairly active in those cells in which these pathways are very important. We should remind ourselves, however, that NADH and NADPH, even though structurally they're very similar, only differing by a phosphate group, metabolically they're not interchangeable. NADH is a product of glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. It contains the electrons and protons that were originally held onto by glucose. The NADH will go through the electron transport chain, donate those electrons and protons to a series of carriers that will eventually end up on oxygen to form water, and a great deal of free energy. The NADPH, on the other hand, is a reducing agent used as a reactant for fatty acid and cholesterol biosynthesis. It's because those pathways require NADPH, they require the electrons and protons that the NADPH will donate to those reactions. So that is the pathway where we will find NADPH as a reactant. The pentose phosphate pathway has 2 branches or 3 stages, depending on how you want to break it up. So we can refer to stage 1 as the oxidative branch, and here the goal is to produce NADPH. And this is produced via the oxidation of glucose 6-phosphate. That will be followed by the non-oxidative branch, which consists of 2 stages, stages 2 and 3. And in the next series of videos, I will describe how those pathways work.